Hey guys, let me take 15 seconds and do the general host thing and say that this is Condé Nast. We've got a big, a lot of floors, not the whole building, but a big building over there. We run 21-ish of the major publications out there. We've been around, some of our publications, such as Vogue, is celebrating its 125th year this year. So very exciting, great history stuff. But we have heard of Bustle, so that's good as well. So we're we're growing and doing interesting things a lot in JS as well. So specifically my talk, talking about data migration. We, I think just about all have probably done data migration at some point in our lives if we've had maybe more than one job. But there's a surprising kind of dearth of information on the internet about how to do it, kind of best practices, what are lessons learned along the way. Also best practices in keeping your laptop on. There we go. I wanted to kind of write down some of the things that we ended up figuring out as we especially leverage GraphQL during our migration most recently. So first of all, migration is always terrible. It's always just like organizing some amount of fire. It's a losing battle at some degree. It's never fun. So let's just use the cool startup kind of vocabulary and talk about like what a lean migration looks like versus kind of a traditional migration. So traditional migrations, you got a big red button. You spend weeks and weeks, months and months planning this whole thing. You move all of your content over one piece at a time in some sort of batches, but fairly sequentially. You do a lot of QA. You usually have a new front end to read that stuff. You may have a new representation of the data in the middle in an API tier. Let's talk about like what it looks like in a lean kind of vocabulary. So obviously we have to use the right term. So we're talking minimum viable migration. We're also talking about continuous migration, which gives you really what you want of gradual rollout. So whereas again, it's kind of often hard or impossible to roll back if you do things improperly on the kind of traditional end. You can undo stuff. You have smaller incremental pieces when you do it in kind of a more sequential way. And GraphQL is a great technology to unlock that. I tried to do some math. I'm not sure if it works, but basically, I think that it proves out. I did the math on this. And all of these items compound with one another. So we have front-end errors. That's something went wrong in your template. In JavaScript, we've got wonderful, cannot read x of y, undefined, null, et cetera. There's all sorts of things that hit us with unexpected lack of data, which cause errors of various sorts, 500s or otherwise, or just something shows up in the wrong place, and you get calls in the middle of the night about that one. All sorts of errors, all different types, status codes, 200s in cases that give me phone calls. API field mappings, obviously if the wrong field ends up in the wrong place in the API, there's a problem, as well as the data itself. There's also sorts of encoding issues that can go wrong here, all sorts of incremental concerns, but these are all compounding. If you have a 99% success rate, 1% error rate, in each of those three buckets, the way that my math works, I'm not sure if this is correct or not, and assuming that many of your content items are compounding because there's often relationships, your articles frequently need contributors. Those contributors, if they don't get migrated, that is a whole section of data that may not get migrated. All of that person's content may not get migrated. So these are compounding in some ways. So if we have 7 content types, which is roughly right for Vogue, 99% in each of those 3 categories, that's about a 20% error rate. That's pretty big. At Vogue, by the time we were done, we got down to under about a 3-4% error rate, which at best practice, set that ahead of time. Talk to your people. There will be times that you get more phone calls and say, hey, this didn't migrate. And you need to be able to say, cool, okay, yeah, that's under the 4% error rate. Is this really critical? Do we have another way we can get this? Because we invested a lot of time to this point. This will take another 4 hours to get 2 more pieces of content. So figure out what's an acceptable error rate before you begin. You want to avoid observable errors, various sorts of errors. So plan your migration. This is kind of the steps that we went into. Enumerate your content, features, consumers. Consumers are various apps, websites, et cetera. Features, let's talk about content. So content is articles, galleries, that type of stuff for us. Various image types, I'll give you a breakdown of that in a moment. Features are, okay, image or articles frequently have images in them. We need to be able to support that feature. Sub-features within articles, in the body section of this article, we frequently need to do embeds. Embeds have some complexities of their own. Twitter doesn't really need additional information stored. You can put that pretty closely in the markup. You just kind of need an ID, and you can figure out the rest on the fly. An image needs a lot of additional information stored that really can't be stored well inline. We need to know more about the alt text and the credits and the caption and the different renditions of this image, other things that are very hard to encode, again, inline in kind of a body area. Then introduce GraphQL. It solves all your problems. Step 4, done. So basically, kind of the same as Steve's talk, that, yeah, just throw GraphQL in front of things. It makes things a lot better. It's generally pretty quick to do. Start there. Find logical seams. As you start to write your actual schema for the different edges of your content that you have, all your different types as you're describing them, think about what your minimum kind of viable pieces are. How can you actually segment a piece of this, pull it back out, and front just that part with your new GraphQL stuff? Build your front-end stuff, and really from 6 to 8 or so, you can usually do these steps simultaneously. And so this unblocks from your kind of traditional waterfall-y migration aspect. So build a new front end against this current data. You're still working, you have not migrated anything, you're just representing it differently. Now you're putting a front end against that, and you can get all the way to releasing the front end without migrating any data. You're making forward progress, you're proving stuff in production, you're reducing your ultimate risk. You're continuously migrating, you're moving forward. Then ultimately, you're going to have to migrate the data. This may require some front-end tweaks by the time you actually say, okay, section A used to be authoritative for this content. Now database B is our authoritative store. But usually those are small. In practice and Vogue, they're small. I'll show you a few examples of actual kind of PRs that made these changes for us. Then really just rinse and repeat, steps 6 through 8, and you're done. Migration. So kind of, it allows you to kind of do this. I did draw these boxes manually to be sizes that made my point. So you know, your mileage may vary. But in general, this can allow you to have some multiple streams happen simultaneously. We've moved the data representation piece to the very beginning, and there's an ongoing data representation part, but I didn't know how to like draw triangles that would show work and such. So we'll just say that it all happened up front. Then you can really unblock your actual front end and the migration itself. Our consumers on Vogue, we're going to go for just a little bit of historical fiction here. We didn't quite have these in exactly this point in time that all these things existed, but hypothetically, this is just easier to reason about. Makes more sense to you guys. Politics and others would be necessary to talk about if I talked about how the world actually was, but this is close enough. So we had a legacy website, WordPress. We tried to turn it off. We have a couple apps out there, and then we have an existing website that fronted a few routes. So basically, those existing sites were pointed pretty directly at a REST API. Copilot is our internal CMS, so we're working with that. It works pretty well for us, but we also find other ways that we can represent the content along the way. We can make it match our app render a little bit stronger. We also have then the WordPress API we exposed to be able to do a little bit of the work. Pretty simply, we were just able to drop GraphQL into the middle of that. This then is our abstraction. We no longer know directly about WordPress or Copilot, and we can actually shift some of those items along the way as we're ready. We just have to understand how to speak GraphQL to it, and we're kind of good to go. So I'll also show that in just a moment. Entities for us generally look something like this. Content contributors, media, and collections are your general representations in most CMSs I've worked on. So content, I'll just break them out now. So content articles for us, this goes on a bit further. Again, I said I probably have 7 or so, but articles, we've got a long form version of that we call the fancy. It's known within Condé Nast as the fancy on Vogue. Galleries are collections of images. They're pretty straightforward. Images themselves and clips are kind of, we can swap them in and out for us. Clips are basically a GIF type format, so you know, GIF V, whatever. Collections, there's different ways that you want to see a collection, multiple items in whenever you view a site. Index pages of various sorts, your home page. Pretty important collection of items. Usually you bring them together via categories or their relationship to their contributor. Search as well is a very common use case. Articles themselves. these are generally their dependencies. There's generally a one-way-ish relationship out to contributors, images, and categories. There's then the embedded content that I kind of addressed earlier. So if you think about, again, minimum viable migration, how do we get this article to migrate from point A to point B? By the time that we export article A, we need all of its dependencies. We need its contributor, its image, and its category to already exist. Or we need to migrate it in some sort of draft state if our nullability of our final resting place for this piece of content allows it. But ideally, we get those things set up ahead of time. We can do this in two ways. We can either do some sort of batch of those items, contributors and categories. We migrated on Vogue that way. They were very simple types. It was easier just to go all in one go and be done with it, and be able to just add some deltas as necessary. Images, we took kind of the JavaScript V8 approach and kind of lazy migrated those. So just as we found those items, we moved them first, and then we completed our migration. Sub features for us on Vogue. This is an entire list that we have these massive, like in WordPress land, we had HTML and shortcodes. In Copilot land, we have exclusively Markdown and other features within it that look somewhat like shortcodes. We call them callouts and embeds and a few other things. So we have this massive spreadsheet that I built to actually say, OK, this is what this is now. This is what it will be in a in-between state. This is what it will be in a future state as far as Markdown goes. But again, we analyzed all of our sub-features. This is a tautology. The sign says, caution, Swan is aggressive. He's being aggressive. This is what our article schema looks like. Back to that first slide, or one of the previous slides I showed you, that showed collections. We then see that top collections, content. We see that top content item being an interface. Then we see the specific implementations involving things like articles. We have interesting kind of edges that I wanted to show here as well of named relationships. Those can be hard to deal with. Contributors are not just one thing. You are not just an author or just an editor or just a photographer, but it is your relationship to a particular piece of content that matters. You can be an author to this piece of content and a photographer on a different piece of content. So we had to kind of do this weird map to allow this map of list of contributors to facilitate that option. This is a query. You're probably familiar from the previous presentation as well as others. So we are simply selecting 8 items. This is actually very similar to the query that runs on our main index pages. We request 8 items. We need just a few things on it. We get those few things. We can render the thing. Pretty straightforward. Interesting, you'll notice that this is on the interface. That will come back up. We did not ask for anything about a specific content type, just on the content interface. GraphQL considerations. All right, so you're migrating stuff. What do you have to think about? How do you sequence your order of events so that you don't lose data, so that you don't misrepresenting things in particular ways, so that you have low risk? As soon as you've got the actual backing of your existing GraphQL, your existing APIs, as soon as you've got GraphQL able to supply a lot of information, release your collection pages first so that you're able to represent stuff. Because as soon as you start to migrate things and you don't have good representation on collection lists of things, you're going to start dropping stuff. Your discoverability of the migrated stuff or the legacy stuff, depending on which direction you go, is going to start dropping. That's not good. So get all of your collection pages. For us, that's feed types, that's our indexes, search I mentioned before, author pages. Get all of those migrated first. Migrate all the dependent data types. I mentioned earlier that we migrated all of the contributors and categories first, and then we had a strategy on how to get images. Build the new types for the new content. So for us, we set up a very similar content type to article called Article Copilot. It looked very, very similar. Almost all the fields were the same. They just resolved a little bit differently. In fact, a lot differently. New data store. So we set this up side by side. We could actually deploy that schema change before we've migrated any data. We rolled that schema change so that we could query on that. There was nothing there, but we could query on it weeks, months before we actually migrated the data. And then we could test stuff in staging and against production data. There were beautiful things that it allowed us to do. Totally non-blocked. We were able to release a support before we utilized the feature. The interesting thing then we get into that we're still dealing with on Vogue, this is where things get a little off the rails. Double resolving and merging content across multiple data stores. Okay, so I've got a home page. I know generally how to get things on that home page. Well, I've got content items that are vying for home page in 2 places. How do I deal with this? The solution we've come up with thus far is make 2 requests. Request 8 items here, 8 items here, with the same sort or cursor, depending on what we're working with. Merge them together, sort them with your same sort, and truncate again to the size that you want. It's a little bit of extra work, not a lot of extra work because we do it early and then we've already truncated so we don't like hydrate out too far. But it's able to get us keeping moving. Push out your fragments first. So in a particular query, somewhere here I've got a fragment. You'll see it in a moment. So if I needed in that feed card sort of situation within my list of items, if I needed specific support for a particular feature, I would have needed to send beforehand, hey, if you happen to see this content type, aka fragment, go ahead and ask for these extra fields. I could do that ahead of time again. So long as my schema is already there, I can add that fragment at any point. I don't have to have a migration yet. I can release all the front-end code without data migration. Then you go live. And again, you're done. So the thing that gets interesting is, what about that old type, that legacy type? Do you replace the data that's in there? Do you map stuff over and say like, oh cool, you asked for article. Articles are no longer authoritative. We're going to fill your fields with what I know you were looking for. You could do that. That could cause you double the content within list requests though. And so we actually opted not to do that. It required some additional code pushes to get there, but it was very minimal downtime. I'd say none, negligible downtime. And so it worked out pretty well for us. So we just did the new type and moved it over. Kind of the secret sauce for us, though, is this guy. All right, so on that content route that I showed you earlier that I really should have had right here again, on that content route, just imagine there's something that says all content, and you can give it some arguments. If you don't give it the type argument, you can give it the type argument and say, hey, on this page, for whatever reason, all I want are galleries, or all I want are articles. If you don't specify that, we have a default set of types. We don't give you all the types. We know about more types than that you could display there, but these are the types that you'll get. So this indicates already different data sources. And we're spreading them together, right? ES6, we're all cool with a lot of dots everywhere. All we had to do from the back end, as soon as we had deployed all those other pieces, that go live step basically looked like us doing a diff from that to that, and we went live. Suddenly, now our default resolvers are getting the right content types. Suddenly, we're done. And then on the front end, we had a few minor just updates to make along the way. These were kind of accidental fields, things we didn't really need, so they didn't really cause us any concern anyhow. We were able to resolve the main content item on just the interface. Do I have anything else interesting? I do. Hey, there's that query that I said I should show you again. So again, we have no type field in that arguments stuff. That is just giving us the defaults all along the way. That's really all you want to see there. So why did we do it in these ways? Because we want to mitigate our risk, have high velocity at the same time. And we all know that those are very scientifically correlated, as it shows here. So what we end up with, on the galleries side, we actually did exactly the migration I just walked you through. We did the front end first, we did all the schema, we did fragments, and then we moved the data. On the article side, we actually had such a large amount of front-end testing that was necessary and all the different edge cases of all the embedded junk that we can drop in the middle of an article that we didn't actually, we actually did it all at once for just that part. We had all the schema stuff ahead of time. We had some fragments in list results, but we actually released the content type at the same time that we did the front end for individual article display at the same time that we did the data migration. And that was just for pure velocity reasons. It was a little greater risk, but good velocity at the same time. Again, these are what you do. You enumerate your content, you figure out who your consumers are, you find your sub-features, interview stakeholders. I didn't hit that one. That's really interesting. So I've been with Conde for about 3 years. I've done, me and my teams have done most of the work on the current Vogue digital properties. Turns out that there's a lot of features that live there that I know nothing about. A lot of people do things on Vogue.com, push buttons that they expect to work that I have no idea what they are doing. This mainly involves editorial type people. At an old job, I got pinged by Google saying like, hey, you've got a bunch of H1s on a page, like you shouldn't do that. And I said, oh my goodness, I messed up. And I started looking through things, and I, in my template, only have one H1. In the body of the content, there are more H1s. Start asking some questions, figure out what happened, and it turns out that somebody decided that they wanted more H1s in the page. And so, okay, so what are you doing? Why do you want this? And they said, because you couldn't do it by default in WordPress. We turned all those things off. You could still sneak some stuff in, but you had to really kind of intentionally do it. We gave them heading options, but those were 2s and 3s. Those were not H1s. So we asked the question, and they say like, oh no, this thing that I want looks way better than those other things that you have. But we designed, and you just overrode and you destroyed SEO. So, okay, great. Same thing at Vogue. We ended up with a shortcode situation where, again, I showed you all the shortcodes. One of them's Instagram. So on that one, we received some feedback that the Instagram shortcode wasn't working, and then very shortly thereafter, they said, oh, don't worry about it. It's like, oh, cool, it fixed itself. It did not fix itself. They found a workaround, and we ended up with a lot of script tags in our pages that we did not anticipate. Point being, interview your stakeholders, talk to people. What do they actually want at it? What do they consider features? Have those conversations frequently. They will bite you in a migration. Avoid fundamental surprise. I'm sure that this will not be the last time that I or any of you migrate a thing from point A to point B, so my parting words are this. Good luck. Questions? Yes.
I always have one. So what made you think of GraphQL, right? So before this, I imagine you were doing migrations in another way. What was it that you were like, you know what? We'll put GraphQL in front of it, and like the world will be better. You know, like how did you come to that decision?
So we actually had the need to support a new iOS app at a similar time. One of the ones that I said we just mapped over to another endpoint. That's the historical fiction. We actually, ahead of that, said we know we're going to be migrating soon. It seems unwise for us to make a direct connection to what we know will be legacy in a couple months to certainly a year. So at that point, we said this would be a great place to abstract some things, get into this vocabulary, and we just started doing research and kind of never stopped. It just made its way to production by the time we were done. So it just kept answering questions. We just kept, like, in my head, I kept coming up with these things like, no, but wait, how does it handle cursor-based, whatever? And it's like, oh, the cursor spec, okay. How does it handle this? How do we get, if this thing potentially has this thing, that's a fragment. Like, it just answered all the questions, so we kept going. Questions?